Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Future Proposed Tank Tech Tree series. It's been gone for a little while. Last time I left it, I'd just finished the Italian tech tree and was preparing to go into the Japanese tank tech tree, which we're looking at in the next few episodes. But I couldn't find much information, so I've had to order one or two books in. They finally arrived, so hopefully I can do a more accurate tank tech tree. Now, I'm going to give a little rundown on the Japanese tanks as I've seen them so far. I'll leave a little annotation to skip to the tech tree itself. But for those of you who don't want to, who want to hear a bit of a rundown of the Japanese tanks, feel free to stay. Japan actually had the fifth largest tank army in 1940 after Russia, well, Soviet Union, France, Britain, and Germany. Japanese tanks also have somewhat unfairly got a bit of a bad reputation because they weren't seen to be successful against American tanks such as the M4 Sherman, which is true, but it's also a bit unfair because the most numerous Japanese tank, for example, the Type 95, wasn't built until 1935 or wasn't put into service until 1935. So it's obvious that an almost 10-year-old tank wasn't going to do particularly great against M4 Shermans while armed with a 37mm gun. Not to mention most Japanese tanks were only supposed to be armoured against small arms fire from rifles and provide infantry support. During the Chinese invasion, they did this very well. They were decently protected and they were able to support the infantry. I don't think Japan expected them to have to fight against other enemy tanks, but when they did, they were generally successful until World War II when they came up against M4 Shermans, which were more powerful and more numerous. However, despite, fighting with pretty old tanks, the Japanese were pretty innovative. I think they actually produced the first mass-produced diesel tank in the world, the Type 89. And, they did come about with some pretty good designs as the war went on. They actually made some very good improved designs, such as the Type 3 Chinu or Type 4 Chaito, but these were kept on the Japanese home islands because they were expected to be invaded, so there was no point sending off tanks to all these different Pacific islands. Not that they could by this point because of the American air and naval supremacy. So they were kept on the home islands to defend against the American tanks, and the invasion never happened, so they were scrapped after the war, and most people forgot about them. Now, stepping away for a second from how the Japanese tanks were in real life, how would they be in War Thunder? As you can see here, we've got a decent tech tree. Maybe it could be fleshed out more, but some of the tanks I didn't have much information on, so didn't include. We've got about 51 tanks and other vehicles here as it is, so, I think this is what the basic tech tree could look like, in, other additions added later on. Now, some you can see I've underlined and put a U next to. These are the tanks I'm not sure if they should be on the tech tree or not sure where they should be. For example, the Type 5 Horu was a very late war Japanese tank that was about the same. It looks a bit like the Hetzer, but it only had a 47mm cannon, which would suggest it should be put very low in the tiers, even though it is a 1945 design. You've also got the Type 2 Ho-I, which was a bit like the Panzer IV, and I don't know whether that should go in assault guns, tank destroyer, or with the medium tanks. So, I am still changing this as it goes on a little bit. But the light tank side of it does seem to be finished for the moment, which is where we're going to be starting off with. But how they will actually perform in War Thunder, Japanese tanks, how can I put it, are very lightly armoured. The M2 machine gun in War Thunder could penetrate something like 26mm of armour at 100 metres. That will probably be enough to penetrate most Tier 1 Japanese tanks, most of the Tier 2, and, it's not until Tier 3 where they get seriously armoured. I think pretty much every Tier 1, or pretty much every light tank Japan fielded, will be vulnerable to M2 machine gun fire, so you're going to have to rely on your guns and not getting hit a lot of the time. Especially when you take into account most of these tanks only have 2 or 3 crew members. Under the War Thunder kill system, if the gunner seat or the driver's seat can't be filled, your tank is counted as dead. So if you have just your commander and your driver, and your commander doubles as the gunner and the loader, and he takes a shot to the head, your tank is killed. No ifs, no buts. If your tank has 3 crewmen, then you lose your gunner. The machine gunner takes over the gunner seat and then he's killed. Again, you counted as killed. So you'll have to be very, very careful when taking fire in these tanks. And have to learn to use them more tactically. However, getting away from the armour, they are quite fast, especially the light tanks, and they do have some okay guns. Some are quite good, but some aren't particularly great. Some are not so good. Um, but overall, Japan should be able to hold its own during War Thunder matches. But you will have to be very tactical with them. You can't just go into battle and expect to take shot after shot because you'll be slaughtered. You have to sort of flank your enemies from prepared, or shoot from prepared positions, that sort of stuff. But now I've spent like 5 minutes talking about the Japanese tank history. So let's get straight onto the tech tree. Now, the first vehicle we're looking at is the Type 92 cavalry tank, although from what I understand it was actually more of a tankette or armoured car. Now, it wasn't particularly well armoured. Apparently the thickest its armour got to was about 6mm, although I've seen other sources that suggest it could have gone up to 12mm. But it was only armed with a 13mm machine gun, but sometimes they could be armed with a 20mm cannon. Now, I tried looking up the penetration values for the 13mm machine gun. There were some wildly different results. Apparently, when the French tested it, they got something like 20mm at 200 metres, or 15 at 400. Whereas when the Germans tested it, at 300 metres they could barely manage 10mm, and at 100 metres at barely 12. So, if we're talking 25mm, that's enough to penetrate most low-level tanks in the sides or rear, and possibly at the front, especially for the really unarmoured early tanks. We're talking 12mm, there's no point. I also tried looking for the 20mm cannon, but just couldn't find any penetration value for it. On the bright side, it could apparently do 25 miles an hour, so I suppose that's one good point out of it. So it could possibly be a good or okayish reserve tier tank, but really it depends if Gaijin can find any figures for those 13mm or 20mm cannons, or accurate ones. Like I said, there's rather different results depending on who's tested the 13mm one, and none for the 20mm one. Now, the next tank is the Type 97 T-Key tankette, which I believe can be a reserve tier tank instead of the Type 92 if the Type 92 doesn't make the cut. Now, this is actually out of chronological order, because this is after the Type 95, but it's a tankette. It would be a bit silly if we had the tank and then a tankette and then a tank. It just wouldn't make any sense, so I'm dealing with that. Yeah, I've put that before the Type 95. Now, this is actually a bit more upgunned because it has a 37mm cannon. Now, again, I tried looking up penetration values for the 37mm cannon, the Type 94 37mm cannon, and I got, again, wildly different penetration values. One saying it only could manage 25mm at 300 metres, another one which gave it 32mm at maximum at 500 metres, or 24 at minimum at 500 metres, or 24mm at 1000 metres, and another one that gave it a penetration figure of about 45mm at 300 metres. So anywhere between 25 and 45mm at about 300 to 500 metres. I have no idea which one to really is right. The one that said 25mm came from a forum, so it's possible that one is wrong. Another one came from a website, worldwar2vehicles.com, which sourced some of it from various books, and some I come from the website itself. The last one, the 45mm penetration, came from a website. I'm not sure of the person's name, Taki. I think they've been involved in books or magazines or something. From what I understand, looking online, they're seen as a bit of an expert when it comes to World War II tanks. So I'm hoping that 45mm one is the correct value, because this would actually make it a little bit better than the Americans' reserve tier tank at the moment, but slightly worse than the Stuarts, which I think would be a fair, matchmaking, or would make it fair for the Japanese in matchmaking. It also goes to show how difficult it can be to research Japanese tanks. I don't particularly remember having these problems with the British or Italian future tank tech trees when researching them. Now, the armour is 6 to 16mm according to the book I'm reading, which is actually, unless I'm mistaken, a bit better than the Type 95s. But I believe the Type 95 gets a better gun, and again the Type 97 Tiki is actually, it's a tankette, so it would make sense to have it become before the Type 95, which is why I've got it before the Type 95. It also has a decent speed again, about 26 miles per hour. Now, like I said before, I think this could be a reserve tier tank if the Type 92 isn't suitable. If the Type 92 is suitable, this should still be a very low battle rate, in no more than 1.3, which is where the Stuarts are at the moment. The Stuarts actually have a better gun, better armour. They're basically superior in all aspects. I don't want this tank to be too high, otherwise it will be unplayable, as its gun wouldn't be able to penetrate anything, and practically everything from 7.62mm machine guns would be able to completely destroy it. But I think it would be a very good early tier tank for the Japanese. Now, the next tank on our list is the Type 95 Hargo light tank, so we're finally starting to get into the, away from tankettes and armoured cars and into light tanks. Now, this was the most numerous of all the Japanese tanks, most produced during the war and before the war, and I believe it was also involved in the first tank-on-tank battle of the Pacific War. I believe they Type 95s v M3 Stuarts and the Type 95s won because they got the first shots off. I think they only disabled one Stuart tank, but, they forced the rest to retreat, so they won the battle. Now, there's actually a few different variants of this. There's an early variant, a late variant, and a variant called the Hokoman. Hokoman, I can't pronounce it properly. I'll talk about these separately, because I think they should all be implemented separately. Now, the early version had the same gun as the Type 97 Tiki, so potentially anywhere between 20 and 45mm penetration at a few hundred metres, about 300 metres. Like I said, I hope it's going to be 45mm. The armour, it was actually really hard to find any armour stats on this thing. Luckily, one of my books did list it as about, if I can find it, between 6 and 13mm. Now, that's again going to be quite bad because practically anything is going to be able to penetrate it, and the gun may not be, particularly the best in the world. Thankfully, it does have a fairly decent speed, about 28 miles per hour, so faster than the tankette. But some of these tanks were sent off to Manchuria, or Manchukuo, and apparently they had a lot of problems to do with crossing certain fields. Planted with kaolian or sorghum. Apparently the distance between the furrows coincided with the space in between the tank's road wheels, which isn't particularly a good thing to have. So they had to introduce modifications. Basically, a modified suspension was developed with a small wheel suspended at the centre of each bogie. And a portion of the Type 95 production run was manufactured with this Manchurian suspension. Now, I don't know if this had the early gun or the late gun from the later version, which I'll talk about in a sec, but it won't be that different from the normal Type 95s. But again, Japan could really have all the different tanks and variants it can get, which is why I've put it in the tank tech tree. Now, as with most tanks, the Type 95 was improved as time went on, and it was given a new gun, the Type 98 37mm tank gun. Now, again, I looked up the penetration figures for the gun, and apparently it could do about 25mm at 500 metres. Remember, the 94 did 45 at 300. The muzzle velocity was nearly 100 metres higher than with the Type 94, so it should hopefully be a better performing tank gun, and hopefully, it'll be a bit of an improvement over the previous Type 95s, which is why I've put it a little bit higher. That said, it probably should still be fairly low down on the tech tree. It's still got a muzzle velocity like 100 metres slower than most other tanks. 100 metres at the best, and slower than the other tanks. So it's still going to have a lot of trouble penetrating other enemy tanks. And that armour, again, is going to be penetrated by absolutely everything. And while it does have a decent speed, it's not particularly a massive great plus point unless you're trying to get to the cap circle before the enemy team can. Overall, if it's put low enough down in the tiers, it should make a fairly good tank. I mean, it's the most numerous tank, so it has to be added in anyway, otherwise it just wouldn't make sense. But it's still going to be quite vulnerable to most other enemy tanks if it's put too high. Now, the next tank on the list is the Type 98 Kini, which is supposed to be a replacement for the Type 95 Hargo, which is quite obsolete by this point. Now that Grants and Matilda 2s have been introduced to fight the Japanese, and the Hargo basically couldn't deal with them. Now, the Type 98 had a better gun. It had the Type 100 37mm gun. Unfortunately, I can't find any penetration values for this. I mean, literally nothing. I found one website that suggested 25mm at 500 meters, but it also said the same about practically every 37mm gun, so I'm probably not gonna trust it. Even trying to find values for the muzzle velocity was pretty hard. I found on the Wikipedia page it mentioned 760 meters a second. On the other website I've been using for the gun penetrations, by Taki, I'll leave a link in the annotations. It suggested a muzzle velocity of 700 meters a second, but there's such a wide gulf between 700 and 760. Is it a 15 meters per second improvement on the last gun, or nearly a 80 meters per second improvement? It's just hard to find any information on these tanks. Fortunately, armour was improved ever so slightly to 16mm to 6mm, which is it's only 2 or 3mm better than the Type 95, still pretty useless. It could do 31 miles per hour though, so I suppose, quite fast. Now, like I said, this was actually meant to replace the Type 95, but this was actually only a few hundred, about 100 of these were built, and then they stopped building this instead and just carried on with the Type 95. I don't know why. Apparently this wasn't much of an improvement. It's not hard to see their point of view. I'm not actually sure if any of these ever saw combat, with so few being produced. But obviously the Japanese thought this was a bit lackluster, this tank, so they produced a new tank, which is also the next tank on our list, and the first tier 2 light tank on our list, the Type 2 Keto. Now again, the armour in this was pretty bad, about 16 to 6mm. Considering this wasn't put into production until 1944, that is ridiculously thin armour. It also did about the same speed, 31 miles an hour. The only real improvement seems to have come about in the 37mm gun. The Wikipedia page mentions an 810 meters per second muzzle velocity. One of the websites, or the main website I've been using, which again I'll link in the description below, mentions muzzle velocity of 785 meters a second and a penetration of about 25mm at 1000 meters. Now, unfortunately, I can't find the penetration value for lower distances, but based on the 1000 meters, that puts it roughly on par with the M3 Stuarts and M5A1 already in game. I think the M22 also uses the same gun as those tanks, so this finally puts the Japanese somewhat on the same playing field as some of the American light tanks. The only problem really being that, again, it's got ridiculously thin armour. Now, the reason I've put this on tier 2 is because we've already got something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, about 6 tanks on tier 1 already. It wouldn't have been particularly good to have 7 or 8 on the tier 1, but I think this should be a very low battle rating. It should be the same battle rating as the M5A or the M3 Stuarts and the M5A1, about 1.3 to 2.3. Any higher than that, I'd suggest the maybe 1.6 or something. Any higher than 2.3 though, and it's just going to get slaughtered because it'll be penetrated by everything and couldn't defeat any of the vehicles it would go against. Now, the next tank is actually more of a modification than a purpose-built tank. It's the Type 4 Kinu. Now, basically, this is a Type 95 Hargo with a turret from the Type 97 Chiha. The Chihas were basically originally fitted with 57mm guns, which were low velocity, which weren't particularly good against armour, so they were retrofitted with 47mm guns, and basically this left a whole lot of turrets not doing anything, so the decision was taken to put it onto the Type 95 Hargo. Now, presumably the whole armour was the same, but the turret armour, I think it was 33mm thick at the gun mantlet, which took up most of the front of the turret, or about 26mm at the turret sides. The rest of it would presumably be the same, between 6 and 16mm, depending on where you're looking at. The 57mm gun isn't all that great, from what I understand. Well, we're using it with just armour piercing it, 20mm at 500 meters, which is pretty bad. But apparently there was high explosive anti-tank, or HEAT, and this had a penetration of 55mm, which is quite a bit less than most other HEAT rounds in the game. But, it should give it a somewhat good advantage 37mm tank guns of the American tech tree, such as the M22 and M5A1. It should also be able to better penetrate some of the other tanks it could possibly face, such as the T-50, early Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, even the M4 Sherman at the side. So, a significant firepower upgrade for the Japanese light tanks. However, even with the firepower upgrade, it's going to be a lot slower because it added something like a ton of weight, the new turret, which slowed it down to about 24 miles an hour, and it's still got ridiculously bad armour. The turret's got slightly better armour, but because it'll probably be a little bit higher in battle rating, that's going to be, negated completely by the additional firepower of better tanks that it's likely to face. Honestly, I don't think it should be a higher battle rating than, say, 2.3. 2.3 is probably the highest I would have it. Honestly, maybe 2 would be a good battle rating, but any higher than 2.3 it just gets slaughtered. Now again, this tank was actually produced in very little numbers, only about 100, and from what I understand, not many of them actually ended up in combat. I think a few were captured in Manchuria when the Soviets invaded, because I think there's one in the Kubinka Museum in Moscow, so obviously some were used, but yeah, not very many produced and didn't particularly help the Japanese that much. Now the next tank I wasn't sure whether to add, the Type 5 Keiho, which was apparently built as a single prototype. But Japan already has, it has a lot of problems with getting suitable combat vehicles, so I am including one or, a few prototypes here and there, if there's sufficient information about them. Apparently one was built, so there must be some sort of information about it that Gaijin could use. Now, from what I understand, it had 8 to 20mm of armour, which is still very bad, but, it's the best they've got at the moment. And the main armament was the 47mm tank gun. Now, this was the same gun used on the Type 97 Shinotos when they got rid of their 57mm guns. So even though it's smaller, it's got much better muzzle velocity. Penetration values, I've heard something like between 40mm at 500 and, if I can get it up, about 55 at 500 meters. So it's a massive improvement on the previous guns. So, it will finally give Japan a fairly hard-hitting light tank. It's also fairly fast, being able to do 31 miles an hour, so it should, be able to get to the cap points fairly quickly and do a decent amount of damage, or, get into good flanking shots and do a good decent amount of damage. Now, if we take the penetration to be about 55mm, this should be able to easily penetrate any light tanks it goes against, including most German including the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs the Germans have. It should also be able to penetrate the sides of the T-34 and the Sherman, as well as the rear of the Sherman. The Russian tank's a bit more sloped at the rear, so it would have a bit of trouble penetrating there. So I think the Sherman's, the first one's about battle rating 3.3, sorry, the first Sherman. I think the Type 5 Keiho should be a battle rating of 3. Any higher than that, and I think it's a bit over tiered or too high a battle rating, but I think it would have, a decent, it should be able to do decently well against any tanks it should meet. It would probably still meet Shermans occasionally, and it should be able to deal with them, but if you put it any higher, it's going to be facing the, later era Shermans, which won't be able to deal with very effectively. The only problem with this, like with pretty much all of the Japanese light tanks, is its armour. It's 20mm thick at the, thickest point, so it's just going to be destroyed by absolutely anything that fires back with it, as will all of the Japanese light tanks pretty much. The other major problem is, of course, only one of these are built. Now, I assume there must be some information on it, but it's possible Gaijin won't be able to find all the information it requires, which may make it a bit hard to implement. But, I thought I should put it here just so this could potentially be in a Japanese future tank tech tree.